in two very different ways. This last year, marked by the COVID-19 pandemic, and this last week, illustrate the plights of all women in the workplace, at home, and on the streets. To overcome these challenges, one solution only: education. Education allows us to overcome prejudice and stereotypes. Education ensures women take part at all levels in shaping society. Education promotes values of collaboration, empathy, and solidarity. We're celebrating tonight one particular woman who created and seized upon her own academic and professional opportunities, Mrs. Justice Foster. To ask her ladyship about her exceptional career, we also welcome two bright women from Jesus College. Dr. Talita de Souza Diaz is the Shaw Foundation Junior Research Fellow in Law at Jesus College. She obtained her Magister Juris and DPhil in Law from the University of Oxford, and was previously a research fellow with the Oxford Institute for Ethics Law and Armed Conflict at the Blavatnik School of Government. Ms. Chelsea Wallace is a BCL candidate supported by a scholarship from Jesus College, following which she intends to pursue doctoral study focusing on the treatment of domestic abuse in human rights law. She is currently a convener of the Law Faculty's Feminist Jurisprudence Discussion Group and serves on the Executive Committee of Oxford Pro Bono Publico. Talita and Chelsea, over to you.
Thank you so much. I think we were going to start our discussion today with some reminiscences, hopefully, of some fond memories at Jesus College. And I'd like to ask, is there a particular moment or event during your career that made you reflect on your position as a woman forging a path in a traditionally male-dominated field?
I think there is. You may find it an unusual moment. It was when I was quite junior. It must have been in 1999, 2000, and the Cleveland child abuse inquiry was going on. It was a very, very difficult inquiry in which a lot of children had been taken away from their parents. Emotions were running very high. I wasn't involved, but a friend of mine, a woman called Presley Baxendale, who was a superb barrister, was in it. And I saw her at the end of the day and she looked wiped out. And I said to her, how's it going? And she said, well, Dame Elizabeth, this is Elizabeth Butler Sloss, another extraordinary woman, still in her late 80s, making a real contribution to the law, who started out as a registrar on the family division, first woman in the Court of Appeal. She was a shining example to everybody. She was chairing this terrible inquiry. My friend Presley was asking the questions. The witness was female, and she said, I was in tears. I could hardly ask the question. I was crying. She looked up and she saw the judge was crying. The witness herself was emotional. The subject was terrible. And she said, and that was entirely right. That was the right reaction to what we were hearing. And I felt incredibly empowered by the idea that the whole scene had been taken by women forward in order, really empathetically, with the woman witness who was recanting, I suspect, about her child being taken away. And it was fine, just to be who you were and how you felt about it. And I thought, if there's space in the profession, and this is quite a long time ago, for that, then I'm happy. I feel that was a moment for me.
Could I just ask a follow-up question with respect to that? Do you think that there, over time, has developed more space within the legal profession for representing emotion rather than just pure reason within the courtroom?
No, and I don't think the representation of emotion is a necessary part of the judicial or the personal representative role. I think emotion, as it attaches to the individual, is not the relevant part. Enabling your client to represent relevant emotions may be very pertinent, but yourself, the experience of emotion rarely is an assistance to logical thought and the distance that you require, I think, either as a solicitor, a barrister, or indeed a judge. Recognizing its effect is another matter. Experiencing your own is obviously there, but there has to be a way of doing that consistent with your intellectual function.
Thank you so much for those insights.
Not at all.
Well, I think it's my turn to ask a question, and I have a less serious question to ask. But this is something that has always sort of like bugged me in the legal profession. So we all know that all around the world, women are, constantly being judged about the way that they look, not just in law, but in any profession, but particularly in law. And I felt this when I was when I was practicing law as a clerk. I felt this pressure to be well dressed and judged on the basis of all the clothes that I was wearing, from my hairstyle to my nails to my shoes, everything. And so at the same time, I feel that these things that we are judged on the hair, the clothes, and the makeup, they can be important ways for women to express themselves. So I was wondering if what role beauty and fashion have played in your own professional life. Did you feel the same, in your profession?
Very interesting question. I love clothes. I have far too big a wardrobe. I adore dressing up. I care about what I wear, and I like unusual clothes. I was very lucky at the bar. I was self-employed, so I didn't have a boss to tell me how to dress or what to do. If I looked a fool and the clients walked away, that was my lookout. But I also had a costume to wear for work. And I think that the ritual of the clothes of court is a very interesting equalizer. And barristers, of course, still wear wigs. We as judges don't. And you have to comb your hair, which is a terrible bore, unless you're sitting in a criminal case. And there is something very, very ecumenical about wearing the same uniform, no matter your age or your gender. And so I think those times when you're being judged as a person, I was very lucky. I could escape it because unless I were appearing in court, I could be the person I felt I could be. It doesn't matter to me that I have to wear a kind of uniform for work, whether it's a fancy uniform or just a business suit, as long as there's some space in my life to be myself. My current role is not about an individual, it's about an institution. I represent an institution. Who I am is irrelevant. And I personally find it very difficult when brooches or T-shirts or indicia of the person thrusting beneath come to the fore. I think that can interfere with the neutrality that you're obliged to bring. But I don't think, I know that no woman should ever be fearful or embarrassed about how she presents herself. I think you should damn well look the way you want to look. And if it seems that your employment is inimical to that, I would respectfully suggest you're in the wrong employment.
No, that's great. I have a follow-up question. I come from Brazil, which is a country that, is not as traditional as Britain in terms of, the uniform that we wear in court. So there is no, apart from the Supreme Court, there are no wigs, there is no uniform, there's nothing. Although I worked for a while at the International Criminal Court, and there we had to wear uniforms, all of us, the same uniform. But I was wondering if you think that there's too much tradition going on in the uniforms that judges and barristers have to wear in court here in the UK. And I'm specifically asking about the wigs. Do you think that they're necessary?
I think it's like a lot of weird tradition, and we have got quite a bit of it on this island, that if you were starting from scratch, you wouldn't invent it. You wouldn't dress like a man from 200 years ago just for the hell of it. But we're not starting from there, we're starting from where we are. And ritual as a concept, I think, is very important. And there are certain indicia of authority in life, and it has grown up that there is a particular process in court, a particular generally appearance to the building, and a way in which people dress that indicate what you're doing now is very serious. This is something that has been going on in this way for a very long time, and it matters. It can have an irreversible effect upon your life. And it's a kind of shortcut, I think, to that little paragraph about authority. If there is an element of ritual that is backward looking, I think that that's a cultural fact. There was a big shake-up, as you may know, in our court dress a few years ago. Much to the chagrin of some, the dress was changed for those doing my role. Wigs off for judges, but on for barristers. Not a lot of logic to it, except, for example, next week, I will be wearing a completely different kind of dress because I'll be in the Court of Appeal Criminal Division, and there you do wear a wig of the old-fashioned sort, a short one. It's a relevant question that you ask now, because I've been conducting, I would say, 80–90% of my cases like this on Teams or on the CVP, and I don't robe, I don't put the wig and gown on. I have a backdrop that's the courtroom, and it is remarkable how the formalities of manner, I think, have changed and have softened because of the compulsive informality of Zooming from your spare bedroom, or litigants are all over the place, and quite literally, and it's had quite an effect. So I do think that it's a subtle thing, and I personally think it does serve a purpose.
Thank you so much, Judge. Over to Chelsea now.
Thank you. I was going to ask if you have, in the recent decades, observed a significant change in the number of women that are reaching the higher levels of leadership and judicial roles in the legal profession.
I thought you might ask me something about that. So I pulled up a report that was just put out a couple of weeks ago. I shan't be terribly helpful to you on change, but the need for change might become apparent. Talking of, was it gender you asked me about particularly?
It was gender, but I suppose in light of
yes,
Black Lives Matter, there's lots of intersectionality debates.
Well, yes. I mean, it's fairly striking that I think it's 39%. I think of judges are female. Yeah, salaried judiciary. The population percentage is 50.8%. Female judges across the board is 39.3%. But when you get slightly further, so as it were, up the scale, at the first tier tribunal, which is not a court but an equivalent, you know, obviously, that there's 51% female. So that's the only figure, I think, throughout the whole of the cadre that is the same representation as women are in the population. Yeah. When you get to the Court of Appeal, 24% are female. At High Court level, 27%. That is quite obviously a considerable increase over the past, but it's still noteworthy in its disparity.
Certainly, and I suppose also in light of the fact that recent figures demonstrate that there are more female than male students of law as well. But I suppose it will take generations before those changes really start to come into effect.
Yes, but I think there is another factor. Entry into the law isn't really the issue. It's staying in at a senior level. It's the cliff edge for senior women. It's the what do you do when other life pressures start to eat into your professional time. I think that's true across many professions, but it's the more women than men, as you say. But then when you get to Silk's level, suddenly it drops off.
Yes, and I suppose in terms of timelines, it's often the significant amount of training required to develop a legal profession career would mean that you're looking into your 30s often before you're even considered for those kinds of roles, at the very time that the pressures of perhaps wanting to start a family would be also becoming very prominent.
I think, isn't that true across professions and life generally? I mean, you look in academic life, what you're looking to be in your early 30s and your mid 30s, or you look at the medical career. I think it's pretty much the same, isn't it? That everything comes to fruition at the same time if you're not careful.
Thank you so much, Talita.
Thank you, Chelsea. So I have a general question about advice that you might want to give young women, including students, early career lawyers, and especially those that are facing, gender-based discrimination, but other forms of discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, in trying to pursue a career at the bar. So what kind of advice would you tell these young women now?
When I look back, and you asked me, I think, Dorothée, when we were discussing what we talk about, what I could remember and think about the time when I was doing it. And I look back and I have to say, I laugh because I don't think I realized, and the Choose to Challenge is such a good title. I never chose to challenge, but I realized in retrospect, sort of being there was challenging in its way, just to sort of do it. I mean, just as an example, and I'm not treating your serious question lightly, I can remember turning up at some awful little magistrates' court when I had no experience at all. I used to do it time and time again every week. And I would go in and there would be the outdoor clerk, the young chap from the solicitors who knew nothing about the case, but he was carrying the buff file, wearing the cheap suit, aged about 17. We'd be standing there. The client would come up, turn their back to me and speak to him because he was going to be the barrister, wasn't he? And that used, if I had a fiver for every time that happened, and you just laugh about it eventually. I mean, I still get letters to my old chambers addressed to Mr. Foster. It just happens that way. And I think you've got to be tough about it. You've got to keep a sense of humor, but you've got to make your point as well. And that's, it's easy for me to say, and I accept that. But I did try to call it out if I saw it. I think you've just got to keep a sense of judgment as to when you do, but do it. Like, don't bawl out. The guy who puts his arm round your shoulders in front of the client, it happened to me, don't bawl him out in front of the client. But my God, when the client goes, you tell him what you think of it. Say, don't you ever do that to anyone ever in your life? What did I do? What? And you tell them. I mean, that particular instance for me, he's never forgotten. He's quite a good friend. So I'll never forget what you said to me. I've no idea that I did that. But you don't do it while the client's standing there. So you kind of, those all sound to me quite superficial answers. I think you have to decide what it is you want and say to yourself, I recognize what's happening here. I don't have to put up with this. What's my best way of dealing with it? Don't self-destruct whilst you're dealing with it. And I appreciate for a barrister, it is so much easier. So much is easier for us than it is for solicitors, for example, because you're not employed. Everybody is notionally on the same level. So you don't have to kowtow to anybody once your foot is in the door. and you can assert yourself when you need to. And I fully appreciate if you are the young assistant and getting your foot in the door entirely depends on what your boss thinks of you. It's different. I think you have to be quite cunning, even now, these days, and you've got to pick your moment, but make your point. And one thing I think is absolutely essential is that all women have to make sure that they look after all women. I have absolutely no time for those who pull up the ladder. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, wasn't it, who said there's a special place in hell?
Yeah, I think it was Madeleine Albright. There's a
Was
special
Madeleine Albright, was it? Well, some wonderful American woman, yeah.
There's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women.
Yeah.
I agree.
And I think, though, that there is scope, and we've been quite slow, or I feel that I have been quite slow, save for one example, in being collegiate. I think this is something that men have been, perhaps by instinct, since the cave, but we don't all wear special ties and different insignia and belong to clubs much. I suppose some of us might. It's not something that I think sits quite so easily. And I think that we ought to do the equivalent, which is look after each other, make connections, network, be aware, be very aware how different and difficult it can be. And remember, just remember what it was like. Look back and laugh if you can, but help when you can. I mean, I tell another rather silly story. When I was head of chambers, I instigated a women's dinner once a year at the Groucho, where I used to be a member, and it was wall-to-wall cocktails from about 6:30. It was a most fabulous night, and we told nobody. I had a list of everyone's email. I didn't square it with anybody else. We just did it, and word got out. And one of the men sidled up to me and said, we think that this is exclusionary, and it's offensive. Can we come? Can we make it a mixed night? I said, no, you certainly can't. And he said, all right, we'll organize our own dinner. Did they? No, of course they didn't. But we kept going. And the fact that it was a thing that was done and it didn't matter was somehow helpful. And the conversations you have when you are women alone, I think, are different. I mean, whether that's good or bad, I don't know. I mean, we've all got a list of honorary people that we'd invite to something like that, but I still think you have to put the hand out and say, come on, it's not as bad as it looks.
Yeah, there are always ways in which you can fight your fights, right? And you have to pick your battles. And this is something that just as Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, if you have to choose what you want, and you have to make your point in a way that others will follow you. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah.
Important lesson. Yeah.
And you have to be heard, and you have to judge in any situation what's the best way to be heard.
Absolutely. I think we should open the floor for questions, because I can see on the chat that Angela has a question.
Sorry, Talita, before we do that, do you mind, Talita and Chelsea, have you both finished with the questions you wanted to give for this first part? Okay, because I wanted, before we open the floor to questions from the audience, I actually wanted to ask Mrs. Justice Foster if she could tell us a bit about her time at Jesus College. I was hoping that you could reminisce a bit about how it was and actually how you came into the law. So I was hoping you could just maybe talk to us.
If people want to hear it. There's nothing more boring, as I remember old codgers coming back and telling you how it was in their day. And it can be very of course I can say a few things. I'm so very fond of my old college that it's a pleasure to reminisce. And I chose Jesus. I mean, that sounds rather evangelical, doesn't it? But I chose Jesus because of what Nigel was saying about what was called also rather evangelically the Jesus plan, which was that male colleges should become co-ed. A group of them, I think it was half a dozen, wasn't it, Nigel? Something like that. And I thought that was a really good thing, and I wanted to be part of something like that. So I was in the second year of that. I think there were somewhere between 25 and 40 of us in college, I think in total by then. So, you know, going with your theme, Jesus did choose to challenge, and it was at the forefront of that. But there are elements about the college that suggested it might be like that. I mean, was quite unorthodox in character, and it had a strong non-conformist base, obviously, with its Welsh ties. And when I was up, Oxford could be a bit Brideshead Revisited, a bit teddy bear. And there were no teddy bears in Jesus whatsoever. It was a different sort of an institution. There's lots of rugby when we arrived, lots of singing. I wouldn't say it was entirely female oriented. I think they'd put in a few loos, and it was obviously intended to be welcoming and was welcoming to us. There was a great sense that we were very welcome. It could be somewhat overwhelming. A lot of singing on a Saturday night after the rugby would drift up, I don't know if they're still there, up through the gratings. And they had those huge bars. I remember being taken down by a mate, I'm sure I shouldn't have been there, that half a rugby team could get in all at once. I hope they're still there. And used to fill up with singers on a Saturday. That was quite fun. Jesus was very, very good to me. But my pathway is not a role model pathway. Don't look at me and do this, anybody. I came up to read one subject, had a week of terrible anxiety knowing I'd made a mistake, and was allowed to change to another, which I very, very much enjoyed. Neither of those were law. I then went on, and I did English course 2, so I had a habit of picking something that looked as if it might be a bit complicated, so I did that. And from there, I went to the Courtauld Institute, and I studied a particular 9th century manuscript, which was wonderful. And then after that, it was really a question, was it going to be academic life, which would have been the natural thing after my first sort of short research degree, or the world, as it were. And at that point, I went to the law, which was something I'd thought of when I was about 16 or 17. But in fact, I'd rather wanted to go to art school. But my parents, without really saying anything, had just said, well, why don't you do this study thing? And I ended up coming to Jesus. As I said, they were amazing because they supported me with the scholarship all the way through the bar qualifications, which I found incredibly exciting. I knew as soon as I started it that actually this was the right step to take. It fitted very well. But I'm very conscious in relaying that history, how that has become effectively unavailable, that I didn't have to pay for anything in my education ever. And I hope and pray that one day education for its own sake will come back into fashion in the way it was in fashion in my day. It was the greatest privilege I could imagine to have had those years. And they've stood me in good stead. I mean, the only thing I can point to is the Anglo-Norman paper I took in schools, which I know what the words mean if they come up in law, but being serious, I think the gift of a broad education that is not vocational is irreplaceable. But I put in a word for the way that things are now moving. Certainly in the Inns of Court, they've evolved their own slightly different system of legal education, which means you don't have to cough up everything up front. You can take it a year at a time. which is a much, much fairer way of doing it, we think. It also costs a hell of a lot less than it used to cost, at least it does at the moment with us, than it does from the other providers. And there's been a bit of a, I think, discussion about that. But it's possible to provide far more reasonable legal education than it has been hitherto over the last recent years. But my memories of Jesus are very fond indeed. It rained every single day of my first Michaelmas term. I'll never forget that. It was the coldest, dampest, most miserable place I'd been for an extended time. But I had a whale of a time, so it must have been pretty good. And I made friends. One friend I've stayed close to all these years, who's also a fellow of the college, and I owe it a great deal. Nigel knows I feel this, but it was wonderful to me. I can't tell you what fun it is to see so many female faces in the important roles that the college has. It gives me great pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mrs. Justice. So now I'm happy to take questions from the audience. There is a first one by Angela Jackson, which is, I'll just read it out. I just wondered what has been your experience of hearing witness testimonies online during lockdown compared to seeing them face to face?
Very interesting question, and I'm trying to think whether I have. I sit preferably as an administrative lawyer, so it's points of law that are argued in front of me. I think I've now adjourned 2 cases which were committal actions. That's to say, where an application is being made that somebody should be committed by me to prison in the context of a civil case, for example, because they've broken a series of court orders. And I have refused to hear those remotely. It didn't seem to me to be appropriate to hear them without the person there being brought in front of me. And the sense that lies behind your question is, I think that it's a very important one, that there is so much lost, even in submissions on law. The nuance of reaction, action and reaction, I find is lost. Other experiences are heightened. You'll be surprised how a lack of formality does not serve, I think, those who are making submissions. I find it harder, I think, than when I'm in court physically, because if you've got a whole bench and you can have papers here, papers on screen, and you can see everybody properly and almost all at the same time, because you have this sort of fishbowl vision. I sit in open court whenever I possibly can. And until we were told otherwise, I would always say to the parties, I have a predisposition towards a hearing in person. Any good reason, of course, it will be done remotely. But quite a few people were very pleased to appear distanced. It's a very different experience, I feel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I now ask people if they want to ask other questions, whether they can either type them in the chat, or if you use your reactions button at the bottom of your screen, you'll see you can raise your hand. There is a further question by Angela Jackson, so I'll take this and we'll see if we have hands raised later on. Let me read this. In 2014, the Law Society Gazette quoted a litigation funder for claims starting at £3 million, £2 million, £1 million, £500,000 and £100,000. These are big sums of money. I feel desperately sorry for people in those circumstances. The defendants get away with bad behavior because they know that it won't be economically viable for the claimant to pay for themselves or be able to find a funder. Any suggestions for reforms to help fund and resolve lawsuits below £3 million? Can crowdfunding be a help or sometimes a hindrance?
That's a very interesting point. I'm wondering if I know enough about it. What I feel myself as a barrister about 2 years ago, about 18 months ago as a barrister, is that the bar has always played a very significant part in giving access to justice to those who can't afford it. And there is a unit called the Free Representation Unit, and there are various ways of, we can approach any chambers, but there are various ways of publicising. There are schemes, there's a Chancery scheme, there's a Queen's Bench, an administrative scheme. Barristers give their time free. It is good for barristers, gets them in court if they want to. It trains people. If it's a small case, it's quite good to do a small case. Nobody pays you for it. Now, there's a long tradition of that. And I'm saddened that maybe it's a question of promulgating the information, but I'm saddened that one doesn't see more of that. I think I'm quite protected. My brothers and sisters in the domestic courts have a really very difficult time with some very difficult, complicated questions and emotive questions dealt with by litigants in person. It has been accepted, I think, that the figures show that the cuts in legal aid have cost much more money than was saved because of the extra court time required for those who have no support and who can't be funded through legal aid because of the limits. It's a problem, though. It's a very knotty problem of funding, and I think also the bar could do its bit. I mean, almost everybody I knew, and certainly me, worked for free for people, and that seems to me to be a good way. It's not the answer to the problem, but it is something that could certainly assist more than it does.
Thank you very much for that. I have a question by Katie Silva. What do you enjoy most, assuming you do, about your current role at Jesus College? Could we do better?
My current role, insofar as I have one, as I'm the honoured guest of the principal, is my role.
You're an honorary fellow.
I think it's wonderful. I was overwhelmed, as Nigel will tell you. I was absolutely overwhelmed by it. It is. I think it's the nicest thing that could have happened to me. I would do whatever I could to hold hands with Jesus in expanding educational horizons. I so agree with the opening remarks. It seems to me that education is absolutely at the heart. Part of, I was discussing it actually with a colleague today, part of the problem of diversity, however you characterize diversity, it seems to me, is that people feel they're not part of the system. They don't understand how it works, and it's not for them. They wouldn't take part in that. They wouldn't be a judge, they wouldn't be a solicitor or a barrister. That's the other side of things. And we don't teach anything about the way our constitution works at school, unless you specialize in something like that. We don't explain ourselves to our children at all. So why would anybody be interested in being part of it? It's actually really interesting. And if you think out of the box, you have an opportunity to make some real change. And I think education, which what you were saying, is just, it's the beginning and it's the end of it. So anything that could help with that, happy to do.
Brilliant. Thank you. I have a question from Violet King-Forbes. So let me read it out. I've read a number of comments over the years on the high proportion of Oxbridge graduates in the law profession, sometimes framed as a criticism, sometimes a mere observation. I wonder what your thoughts on this are on this, whether it is something that should be discussed further in terms of the wonderful benefits of an Oxbridge education versus the potential implications in terms of representation.
What an interesting question. I'm both overjoyed and dismayed. A friend of mine who is not an Oxford graduate said to me, have you seen the whole of the Supreme Court is Oxford educated except for one? And he, curiously, I think that's Professor Burrows, who came through a different route. I think presentationally it's very difficult because it suggests itself as evidence of people appointing people like themselves, which is the pale male stale argument, if you like, rewritten. I think it is a symptom of what we've been talking about access, about education generally. I think it's fab for Oxford, and I'm not surprised, but we want everywhere. We want everywhere to be in Oxford. And what's quite interesting is the intake to the judiciary now. I've got the figures somewhere, but it's pretty much even Stevens, maybe a little bit less for state educated people than it is for non-state educated. As you get higher up the ladder again, in other words, to older people, Court of Appeal, I think it's something like 70-30 or 65-35. But otherwise, I think at my level, it's looking towards equalization. And Jesus has always, I think, been very open-minded about the educational background of its alumni. It's not predisposed one way or another. It recognizes where people, what people are, as opposed to where they come from. And a bit more of that, I think, would be helpful. It could be happening, I think, is what I'm saying to you. I think at the top end, it isn't, and that's partly a function of time.
Thank you very much. We have a question. Miles Jackson has his hand raised. Miles, do you want to ask your question directly?
I will, thank you. I wonder if I can ask about the transition to being a judge and whether you do or you will miss the partiality and independence, and you can fight a cause as a barrister. Now you have to be formal and serious and impartial. You can never take a side. You're part of a bigger system. I wonder what that's been like as a change in your professional life.
Well, I probably would take issue with you about the notion of partiality as a barrister, other than that you're paid to run one argument. At the bar, an ability to view it as the judge was going to view it was priceless. And that's what I strived for. So I hope that that part's not too much of a transition. What I have to be careful of is not saying to barristers, as I have heard judges say way back when, what you really mean is, no, what you're saying is so-and-so, thinking, I could argue this better than you. Don't put it like that, put it like this. And you have to be quite careful. You step back, allow someone to settle down, make their submissions, allow them to be their best selves. If they're just incapable of that, and some people are, then you can assist. But I hope that at some stage in a case, a barrister and of course a solicitor would give an impartial view for the client and say, look, there's this and there's this. If you say, do I miss the cut and thrust of the courtroom? I do. I miss that feeling as you walk out of court and it's over and your client says, oh, you were fab. No one ever emails you as a judge and says, do you know you're brilliant? Doesn't happen. And you also, when the clients walk out, when the barrister's behind them, your work as a judge starts, because you're left then to write the judgment and it's not over for you. So it's a very different rhythm of life. I miss the people I worked with tremendously, and I have to be circumspect. I can't go around there every Friday night and have the usual drink we used to have. But I keep in touch. And also, I took this job late. I had a long career as a silk, and I loved it. And I'm very much enjoying the change. So personally, It may not have been a personal question, but personally, I like the change very much. But you're right to note there's a difference between the two. But I think when you look a little bit deeper, maybe it's the same sort of approach that's required in both jobs.
Thank you.
I see we have a question from Nigel. Nigel, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, a couple of years ago, I had the privilege of chairing the Royal Society's book prize, and the winner was a very interesting author. It was Caroline Criado Perez, who wrote this book called Invisible Women, Exploring Data in a World Designed for Men. And she was data bias in a world designed for men. Yeah. It was this very interesting proposition that so very often the bias in the data that's presented to us in so many respects, whether it's designing travel or urbanization or everything from the way we design drug trials, has the default as the average man. And I just wondered if you felt, though, that you'd come across examples in what you do where you feel somehow the data you're having to deal with, you've got to try and counter these fundamental biases.
It's a very interesting question. To be anecdotal first, I personally encounter it when I walk into court. The chair is enormous. And as a medium-sized woman, if I'm not careful, I'm like this because it's built for a big man. So you have to make sure your clerk puts a cushion down, or you don't end up, looking like a child at the grown-ups table. And there are many women who are shorter than I am. So everything is built to a man's shape. That's certainly true. The other one, I'm afraid I made a joke about. My nearest loo, to lower the tone for a minute, has two doors. One says gentleman, the other says staff. So, and somebody's made me a sign in my room that says ladies' room. I'm reading it now. Women, dames, queens, all welcome here. Because I said, what is this? So yes, on a superficial level, I think the interesting question, I think there is an expectation that behavior is male and emotion is female within the system. I probably fulfilled that stereotype by telling you the story that I told you right at the front of the interview. But it struck me, and it probably struck me because I thought, wait, this is acceptable. You can be the way you feel in a circumstance that demands it. But I think in other areas, there is a bias towards control being a masculine attribute and the lack of it female, which plays against both men and women. And I think the system has that built in.
Thank you very much. Do we have more questions? I mean, we have an observation that these sort of unconscious bias or physical inequalities in buildings and stuff also happen in academia with lecturers that are not made for women, and especially short women who may find that complicated to navigate. I can confirm that. Do we have more questions from the audience, or one last question from Chelsea or Talita?
Perhaps I should just say, though, I'm thinking about what I'd said. The real concern, joking aside, the real concern would be if they're still building courts with chairs like that now, which they're not.
No,
I'm talking.
It's extraordinary. I mean, just on that point, until very recently, they were designing safety procedures with male mannequins. And the famous example of seatbelts designed in cars, where they do not design it for the female form. And the thing is literally unsafe for the female body shape in some really important respects. I'm sorry. But
yeah, there's a comment down here about gardening equipment and power tools. It's absolutely right. Yeah. And I think it's, yeah.
PPE, the masks. So now we having to wear masks. Every single mask that I buy is gigantic on my face, gloves, everything.
I hadn't thought of that. That's a good point. Yeah, I always think it's for someone with a really long nose, but yeah, maybe it's for a man. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it was quite amusing when I went to, they always try and give you a set of robes rather than have a new one made when you're appointed. And there's a rather great institution, a sort of wardrobe institution that you go to. And they gave me a set of robes for a job whom I won't name, but he's 6'2" and he's quite well built. And I just disappeared inside them. There was just, I'm sure we could cut that down. I'm sure you couldn't. So I had to go off and have some made. But it's quite, yeah. I don't really think about it, I suppose. It's an inevitability is the answer. It's an inevitability. And you do get kind of used to it. Wouldn't you say, Dorothee?
Yes, I think I do find some pleasure in pointing it out, because I think that's also the way, just to make everyone else uncomfortable around you. I think that's also how
yeah, that can be amusing.
Bring about change.
Yeah, very subtly, you can just tell people, look, see how big this is on me. There's always a way in which you can point out, but it's important to always point out.
Agreed. Do we have one final question? It's almost 6:30. No, Nigel, should I leave it to you after I thank immensely everyone for attending, and of course Mrs. Justice for joining us this evening. This has been immensely enjoyable and illuminating for someone who does not work or study the law. So thank you very much. I see we have one last question by Angela Jackson. So maybe one last question and then Nigel can conclude.
Sure.
Sorry, Dorothee, I think we can't hear you.
Yes, the person who's raised their hand, could they unmute themselves? I can't see you very well because you seem to be in the dark.
I am in the dark, sorry. It's just to point to the question in the chat from Matt Williams, which is an important question about access that he wants to be able to relay in the recording. You see Matt Williams' question in the chat?
Yeah, so that's Jude's remark. We'll share this recording with young people in our access regions. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a young person thinking about a career in law? Thank you, Angela.
Go and sit in court at the back when courts are up and running, criminal courts. Go and sit in the local county court. Talk to the ushers. See if somebody who's doing a case will talk to you. Just sit and hear and see what it's like. See how it makes you feel and see if you feel that you want to be part of it. But do it and do a lot of it, so it gets under your skin or doesn't.
That is brilliant advice. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Over to you, Nigel.
Well, look, thank you. And thank you for all of you participating this evening, and to Dorothea and to Talita and to Chelsea. And most of all, of course, to Dame Alison. Alison, thank you so much for that. It is wonderful to have you kind of closing out our series of events for International Women's Week. And it's absolutely wonderful to have you as an honorary fellow. And it's been very frustrating because we were able to kind of make this wonderful announcement, and we're expecting everybody to kind of gather. In fact, we had a Domus dinner organized almost exactly a year ago. And there are all of those bits of sociability that make a college the collegiate sort of place it is have been rather diluted by the digital experience of the last year. But we are deeply anticipating April the 5th and next term, when we'll be starting to get back together. I mean, we have about a third of our students on or around about Oxford at the moment, but to be able to get back into college, to become sociable again, and to just welcome you back into the college, which you're clearly so very fond of, and which we're so glad to have been part of your history and your personal testimony. Thank you so much for that. It was a fascinating insight, and so great to talk to you.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. I was really charmed and delighted. Thank you for your welcome, and it's been great fun. I really look forward to seeing. I wish I was with you there, raising a glass of wine at this moment.
We'd all very much like this too.
Thank you very much indeed. I really have enjoyed it and look forward to seeing you, I hope, before too long.